David Gellis is a climate reporter for the New York Times. He previously covered Wall Street, holding big name CEOs to task. And this combination of experience made him the perfect person to write a new book called Dirtbag Billionaire: How Yvon Chouinard Built Patagonia, Made a Fortune, and Gave It All Away. In the billionaire era, it's a really important book that raises a lot of important questions. So I'm thrilled to have him here today. David Gellis, great to see you.
Great to see you.
So tell me why you decided, after writing a piece about Yvon Chouinard in 2022, why he deserved an entire book about his life and the company he built.
Well, I've been a business reporter for 20 plus years now, and I'm always looking for those seminal characters. Individuals that have a great story themselves, but also speak to some of the broader trends that I'm seeing in corporate America. And Chouinard has always been one of those. Patagonia, for decades, has been known for its social, environmental responsibility. But when I wrote this story 3 years ago about him giving away the company, it was such a break with how most billionaires treat their wealth. It struck me that there was really a much deeper story, and that in telling the story of Yvon Chouinard and Patagonia, we could learn a whole lot about the business world and really about the whole world, the natural world as well.
And also about the ethics of the business world, right? And that is what I guess really puts Yvon Chouinard in a whole different category. And I think it's interesting to note that when you wrote the original piece, you had just published a book about Jack Welch called The Man Who Broke Capitalism: How Jack Welch Gutted the Heartland and Crushed the Soul of Corporate America, and How to Undo His Legacy. Wow, a very different approach toward Jack Welch. But how did writing about Neutron Jack, as he was called, influence your desire and how you wrote about Chouinard?
Yeah, that was an angry book. There's no denying it.
Well, I mean, you could kind of tell from the title.
Just a little bit, right? I actually almost called it Neutron Jack, and
Yeah.
still part of me wishes I had. But that was a book that tried to explain how we got to this state we are in, right? In a world of radical wealth disparity, in a world where so many employees in corporate America have a hard time keeping up. Jack Welch was part of the answer that I came up with that helps understand how we got the system that we got. When I was doing the press for that book, everyone kept asking me, well, so what do we do about it? Are there any good examples you can point to? And one of the examples that kept coming up over and over was Patagonia. Not because they're perfect, not because every company can be like Patagonia, but because some of the values that they represent, some of the ethics, as you said, if extrapolated, if other companies tried to model their behavior a bit like Patagonia, we might have a somewhat different system. And so that was one more reason why I kept coming back to this story. In my reporting for the Times, I've written about Patagonia for many years, and why I ultimately wrote the book.
Just to put a button on the Jack Welch stuff, he was so worshipped when I was at NBC, and I went to his funeral at St. Patrick's, and people just, treated him like a king.
Yeah.
And so much of corporate America really respected him. Did you get much blowback from the book after you wrote it? Because it really did shatter sort of the mythology of Jack Welch.
Yeah, tremendous blowback, in fact.
Yeah.
I got a lot of his acolytes, people who revered him.
Like David Zaslav, for example.
I may have gotten some emails from Zaz about
Yeah.
this book, no question about it. And listen, I know Zaz, and I've worked with him. I've reported on him for years and years. I respect him. I don't think he's a bad person. I don't think Jack was inherently a bad person. But the way in which he ran GE for those 20 pivotal years and the impact that his leadership had on the rest of corporate America, I really believe had a truly deleterious effect on our economy at large. And so when I did that myth busting, when I sort of really tried to rewrite his legacy, there was no question a lot of people were fighting back. And I heard from Zaz, I heard from others. And listen, Jeff Immelt went public and sort of tried to launch a campaign to suggest that everything I was saying was wrong. I went back, and we can revisit that anytime you want. I'll get on stage and debate Jeff anytime.
Before we move on to Yvon Chouinard, I'm just curious from your perspective, someone, David, like you, who has covered business and the corporate world for so long. You know, where did it go wrong? What happened that the corporate world changed dramatically and was an instrument for income inequality, where CEOs made so many times the salary of their average employee? I was listening to a podcast with Evan Osnos, who wrote The Haves and the Have-Yachts. And it's a book about extreme wealth in this country. And I've talked to my husband about it. I've talked to other, people in business. And what forces would you point to that made everything different?
Yeah. Well, of course, it's not just one thing.
Right.
But you have to remember that in the 70s, suddenly we had stagflation. After decades of real sustained economic growth following World War II, suddenly the economy was sort of flat, the stock market was sort of flat. We had rising inflation, not unlike we do today. And so people were hungry. People wanted some kind of change. Into that void, you had a couple of really disruptive forces. You had Milton Friedman coming in and saying, the social responsibility of a business is to increase its profits. You had Ronald Reagan come in and really start espousing trickle-down economics and being much more amenable to a deregulatory agenda. And then you had Jack Welch. And Jack Welch, I argue, was the CEO who first occupied a position of real power inside corporate America. CEO of General Electric, arguably the most important company in America at the time. And he's the one that operationalized it all. He's the one that sort of seized on those animal forces and took it and ran with it. And as a result, in a matter of months after him taking over, you had a wave of layoffs, you had offshoring, downsizing, and this effort to return cash to shareholders. Now today, you might hear about that and be like, yeah, that's what companies are supposed to do. But it wasn't how we got the America that we came to know and love. Back in that golden era of capitalism after World War II, companies were much more focused on taking care of their employees, their communities, even paying their taxes. And yeah, profits for shareholders were important, but they were sort of an afterthought. The inversion of those priorities is really what got us to the place we are today.
Well, let's contrast Jack Welch with Yvon Chouinard. How is he different, and how was he different when he created Patagonia?
Yeah, so Chouinard, one of the things that's so extraordinary about him, as I charted his life from a very early age, is that the last word you would ever use to describe him would be ambitious. This is not a man who ever wanted to build a company. He never wanted to be an entrepreneur. He never wanted to make money. He was obsessed with nature and rock climbing, and it was only by accident that he suddenly found himself at the helm of a modestly successful climbing gear company and then an apparel company.
Before we move on to that, though, tell us a little bit about his childhood and what shaped his philosophy as a little kid.
Yeah, this was an outcast from the outset. He grew up speaking only French in northern Maine. He didn't speak English until he was about 10 years old. He was obsessed with nature, hiking and catching fish. He would skip school and go catch frogs in the Los Angeles River once he moved to California. And whenever he could, he would skip class and go free diving or rock climbing or catching hawks. So this was really an iconoclastic kid who became an iconoclastic founder. But his real pivotal moment came when he became part of this rock climbing crew. This is the 50s, the early 60s. These are the men, and they were mostly men, who started to scale the big walls of Yosemite. And Chouinard was one of these really daring adventurers who decided he was going to put his life on the line just for the sake of trying to scale this wall. But he needed better tools than he could buy, so he made them himself. And that's how he got into business.
You write that his father had instilled in him something that, quote, when you buy a tool, you buy the absolute best tool you can get and keep it for the rest of your life. That had a big impact on him and his products, didn't it?
Here we see the emergence of his sort of worldview and the values, the ethics that you said, shaped him as a young man and continued to shape the company 50 plus years later. And that one that you just identified is at the heart of it all. It's quality. he understood very early that it didn't make sense to buy low quality products, whether it was a hammer or a piton, one of these climbing gear pieces that he was making, or a jacket. And that's why from a very early moment in his business career, he insisted to his employees that they make the highest quality product they possibly could. It had to last a long time. It had to fulfill its function. But what's so interesting is as his career goes on, his understanding of what quality means gets much more holistic. He starts to think about the ingredients in the products. Are there toxic chemicals? What is the supply chain like? What are the workers in the tier 3 factories making the original materials? What are their lives like? And that more holistic understanding of quality leads to all sorts of the really revolutionary things that Patagonia then goes on to do.
Well, he had to pivot and adjust a lot, right? For example, when he developed that climbing gear, he noticed that it was, really hurting, I guess, eroding or scratching
You got it right.
the surface of the rocks, right? So he said, wait, I've got to build a better piece of gear that doesn't do that, right?
That's exactly right. But let's just pause to acknowledge what a remarkable moment this is. There was a CEO who had a successful business, and he understood that the product he was making was having a negative impact in the world. And he said, okay, I'm no longer going to make that product. Can you imagine a tech company doing that today? Can you imagine a company that said, oh, we understood our social media product is harming young people, young women, and saying, well, we're just not going to do that anymore? That's not the world we live in today. But Chouinard had that deep sense of values and ethics at the core of his business. And he said, we'll find something else, but we're not going to keep doing that.
So what did he do?
He came up with a better mousetrap. He came up with something called chocks. These are different ways to secure his carabiners and his ropes to the wall, ones that didn't actually damage the wall, as you said. And that became a big business. He then went on to start making clothes. And that's where, in 1973, Patagonia sort of comes into being, not just as a rock climbing business, but as a company making shorts and shirts and rainproof jackets and fleeces and all the rest of it that we know today.
But it's interesting because as he made those items of clothing, he would often have to iterate when new information became available that these products may not be the greatest. And he would audit the use of these products like nylon, polyester, acrylic, and cotton, and sort of maybe look holistically, but also with the benefit of new information, kind of adjust or change his approach. Can you talk about how that happened time and time again?
And it's the same pattern that we saw with the pitons that were hurting the wall, repeated in the apparel business. And I think a real seminal moment came in 1988 when a group of Patagonia employees at a store in Boston all suddenly fell sick. They started coughing, they had headaches, they were nauseous, and clearly there was some contaminant in this new store. And it took a minute, but they figured out that what had happened is the new finished cotton t-shirts that they had been storing in the back room had been treated with formaldehyde. And there was so much of this toxic chemical on these new t-shirts that people were getting sick. That led to a big series of questions. Why the heck do our new cotton t-shirts have formaldehyde on them? What is conventional cotton all about? As they started digging into that supply chain, they realized that conventional cotton, as it was being produced at the time, was really toxic. And it was really toxic not only for people, but for the plants, for the bugs in the field. And when they understood that, they made another one of these pivotal decisions. They said, we're not going to do conventional cotton anymore. We're going to transition 100% to organic cotton, even though we don't know how, even though we don't have the supply chain set up, and even though, critically, it probably means we're going to lose 20, 40% of our sales in the next year. They did it anyway. And there again, we see this commitment to sort of doing what they feel was right, even if it meant it was going to cost them.
And then there were other examples, right, where sort of fleece would have microplastics or certain materials which shed microplastics, and they'd have to say, okay, what can we do now? I mean, this happened time and time again, right, David?
They're still on this journey today. I mean, they're working on the microplastics issue, but it's a really tough one to figure out. They try to use recycled plastics, but those shed microplastics too. And even more recently, they're trying to deal with PFAS, these forever chemicals that
Right.
are all over the place in this country. And that
So
we're
are they in their clothing too, or just
They
in?
have been
Yeah.
historically, and they're finally at the moment where they think they've phased out almost all of them. But it took years and years because Gore-Tex, the maker of this waterproof treatment that was pivotal to Patagonia's waterproof offerings, well, guess what? Gore-Tex was using PFAS. So they have been on this multi-year journey with Gore-Tex to try to figure out a non-toxic replacement, and they think they finally got it right.
I mean, it sounds like the company is too good to be true. If you had to really do an audit of their ethics and their behavior, I mean, what didn't they get right? And there are a few things in your book. I mean, it's not kind of a wet kiss towards Yvon Chouinard. I mean, you do have some critical things in there, but looking back, what do you think were some of the mistakes they made along the way?
Yeah, it's important to note that I say it in the introduction. Patagonia is not perfect. Chouinard is not perfect. They have made a lot of missteps along the way. And I would count on that list certainly Chouinard's sort of completely insane management style, which included just leaving the office for months at a time without really setting up a proper chain of command, cycling through many executives, changing his mind immediately upon coming back from a climbing trip. I mean, the list goes on. People looked to GE to be a model of management, right? Harvard Business School wrote case studies about GE management. Everyone went there to farm their next great CEO. Not the case with Patagonia. This place was often very chaotic and often sowed chaos by its own CEO. On the product and materials front, listen, let's just state the obvious. Patagonia is a company that professes to care about the environment, and yet they're in a business that takes an extremely severe toll on the natural world. That tension, that paradox, is at the heart of the company, and they recognize it. They try to do their best, but they use fossil fuels to transport their goods. Their products that they get, yeah, they might try to use organic cotton as much as they can. They're still taking a tax on the land. The labor that they use in their factories is often in the developing world. And I've been to those factories, and those are people who are not making the wages the executives in Ventura might enjoy, and they're working really long hours in loud, hot factories. Now, those factories might be marginally better than the factory down the street because Patagonia does try, but there's no divorcing Patagonia from the complex, imperfect system that we all live in.
But net, do you think that they can brag about what they've done? I mean, you're right. I've sort of talked to companies about this, and there's always like a cost benefit analysis. Like you said, you can make shampoo bottles that are biodegradable and won't fill up landfills, but you also have to maybe use too much water to make them work. Or the thing about using, transportation costs and using oil to move things. And, like it is a paradox, I think, for a lot of these companies. But when you look at Patagonia, clearly they've tried harder, but have they succeeded in being an environmental corporation or not?
That's a great sort of declarative framing that puts me on the spot. Yeah, I mean, listen, on balance, they are better at it than just about any other company I've reported on in my 20 years. And part of that is the actual work they've done. And, you can talk about this program or that program. But what I would really point to is their consistency and the commitment. Because I can't tell you, Katie, how many stories I've written for the New York Times about some company's big new green initiative. And then 3 years later or 5 years later, a new CEO comes in and that work is gone. They just tear it up. That's not the case at Patagonia. They have kept trying all these years, and I think that alone is so remarkable.
You're taking me on a tangent. I'm just curious, because you have been covering business and the environment for such a long time. Do you notice that businesses that once cared about the environment, and we're leaving out greenwashing, that pretended to care, but who actually did take steps to be more environmentally conscious, in this new administration have abandoned those efforts for the most part? Or do you see other companies like Patagonia who are still trying?
I would make two remarks. The first is that, on balance, I think corporate America is a whole lot more responsible and sustainable than it was a couple generations ago, right? If you look back to the 90s when you were covering business, companies just weren't thinking about this stuff at all. So I would argue that many companies are really addressing everything from emissions to their supply chains in more serious ways than they did several decades ago. As to how companies are showing up during this political moment, I think it's a very different story. I was the reporter at the Times who was really tasked 8 years ago with covering corporate America's response to the Trump administration during his first term. And over, I would write stories about CEOs and companies speaking out and saying that what they were seeing from the White House simply wasn't acceptable. They said it wasn't American. Fast forward 8 years, and a lot of the policies that we're seeing come out of this White House are the same, if not more extreme versions of what those companies were reacting to 8 years ago. And yet it's silence. Over and over again, the same CEOs at the same companies confronted with what this administration is doing, things that almost certainly would have had them screaming from the rooftops 8 years ago, they're silent. And if they're not silent, they're showing up at press conferences at the White House. And that is a shocking reversal of fortunes.
Have you done a story on that and looked at the companies from 2016 who were screaming bloody murder about environmental issues have now suddenly, shut their pie holes?
I have indeed. And when I contacted almost all those companies for comment, they said, we decline to comment.
You also talk about Yvon Chouinard donating to environmental causes, which laid the foundation for some very monumental gifts to come. When did he have the epiphany that he wanted to do this in addition to building this company?
This started at a very early age, and as so many things in his life, it happened quite by accident. In 1973, right around the time he founded Patagonia, he also made his first donation to an environmental activist. This was a guy named Mark Capelli, who was trying to preserve the Ventura River right behind the Patagonia office. And Chouinard said, well, I approve of that because if they mess with the river, it might affect my surf break. And I only moved to Ventura in the first place to get this surf break. And so he started funding this one little grassroots environmental activist.
Which shows that all altruism is self-serving, but go on.
Indeed. And that was the beginning of this journey he's been on for the last 50 years of using a lot, maybe even most, of the money he has made from this company to protect wild places, to support grassroots activists, and to embark on some really large-scale conservation projects. But it was, again, one moment sort of planted the seed, and then you fast forward a few years, he gives a bunch of money to some people conserving forests in Chile. That fast forwards, and he's helping his friend Doug Tompkins buy up big parcels of land in South America. He then buys his own big swath of the tip of Argentina and creates a national park there. And now, of course, Patagonia's profits almost entirely are going toward these same sort of ends.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating thing that he did. And that was in 2022 when you wrote that article, right?
Yeah.
But having said that, I think it's interesting, but I guess it's sort of apropos that he's allergic to the word billionaire. Like he is a billionaire, I'm assuming. Well, was a billionaire.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was.
He was a billionaire, but he really did not want the history books to describe him that way. What was it about that word or about that class that so repulsed him, I guess?
He has been allergic to wealth his whole life. He grew up relatively simply. His family was poor at times, and you could imagine that that would instill in him at least some appetite for the finer things in life, but it really never did. He always stayed incredibly grounded and sort of uninterested in material possessions. And then as he started to look at how extreme wealth was shaping society, and how the wealthiest among us were using their fortunes, he just sort of grew disgusted with the whole thing. That appreciation of nature that started when he was a boy was never crowded out by an enthrallment with the finer things in life. And that's unusual, but it's authentic.
He's not materialistic, but he does have some nice pieces of property, right?
He has some nice pieces of property, but if you were around in 1973, you could have probably bought some nice real estate in California and Wyoming too. The houses, while they are in extraordinarily lovely spots, are very modest. You know, I went and spent a short week with him and his wife Melinda at their home in Wyoming. It's literally a log cabin, and it is cluttered with secondhand furniture. Katie, we were cooking off a cast iron skillet he's had for 50 years. There was absolutely no help around. We cooked every meal ourselves. We washed the dishes at night together. This is truly a simple man with a simple worldview. And that alone makes it extraordinary.
He once said that every billionaire is a policy failure.
He not only has said that, he has it as a bumper sticker on the back of his 1999 Toyota hatchback in Wyoming. When I asked him how it was that his children were comfortable renouncing their claim to a multi-billion-dollar fortune, he didn't miss a beat. He said, "My children were brought up right. They don't want to be billionaires." And I thought that was so telling, right? He understood that part of his legacy as a father was passing on this same mistrust of extreme wealth to his children. And just one note about the title of the book. It's called Dirtbag Billionaire. And when he first heard the title, he was so pissed off. Not because of the word dirtbag. He self-identifies as a dirtbag. That's a term of endearment in the climbing community. He was pissed off because of the word billionaire.
That's so funny. We'll talk about how he did give the whole give the whole company away, and basically turn Patagonia into a nonprofit. You don't have to get into too much detail, but how the hell do you do that, David?
Yeah, well,
run a successful business, right?
So what happened was in 2017, Forbes magazine put him on their annual list of billionaires, and he freaked out. He got stomping mad. He went around the office telling everyone who would listen, "You have to get me off this list." It took several years, but finally he convinced his team that he was serious. They needed to figure out a way for him to give away his wealth. But doing that was going to raise all sorts of complicated questions. What happens to the company after he no longer owns it? If they sell it or if they do an IPO, would they lose control? Where does the money go? It took them a long time, but they finally figured out this solution in 2022, whereby Chouinard and his family actually got rid of their equity. So they are literally no longer the owners of Patagonia stock, which was worth several $billions, and through which Patagonia, the company, retained its independence and also created a structure by which it now donates all of its profits to charity on an ongoing basis.
Except for what they need to keep the business operational, right?
Correct. All the profits that aren't reinvested in the company. So salary, R&D, payments for employees, real estate, all the things that it takes to keep a company going. But whatever they would typically either hand over to the owners or distribute to shareholders if it was a big public company, all that money, which in the case of Patagonia is, as much as $100 million a year, all of that is being sent out the door to the same causes Chouinard has always cared about: conservation and grassroots environmental activism.
You mentioned cooking dinner on a 50-year-old cast iron stove, but you do say that he's a paradox. You write, with 2 houses of his own, an aggressive travel schedule, and a growing business next to the Ventura River, he was hardly an ascetic. There was also multiple mentions of him flying in private planes, unable to relinquish control of the company because he's the only one who could oversee it all. So he was a bit of a paradox in that way. But I guess, when I read stuff like that, I think, well, give the guy a little bit of a break.
Yeah.
On the other hand, do as I say, not what I do a little.
Yeah. There's no resolving this paradox. And that was part of what ultimately made this book so fun for me to write, because it wasn't one where there was a pat, easy answer to some of these questions. There's a creative tension at the heart of this company and this man. You could call it hypocrisy, you could call it a paradox or an inconsistency. It's all fair, but what it is this tension between capitalism and conservation, between trying to take care of the planet and being in a business that takes a toll on the planet. Between trying to live a life that gets him really close to nature and yet being, at one point, one of the wealthiest individuals in the world with the means to travel by private plane. These are the inherent tensions that make it such a weird and compelling story. And it's not my job to pass moral judgment on him. Instead, what I try to do is make it an instructive story that individuals, employees, executives, and companies can learn something from.
Who's he friends with? Does he go to the Allen Company conference?
Oh, God, no.
Does he eschew all of these, excuse me, big swinging dicks who are billionaires? Is that just not his scene at all? Who does he hang out with? I know he's still alive. He's 86, right?
86 years old. He hangs out with his fishing buddies. He and I've hung out with those fishing buddies and him. We spent a lot of time fishing together during the reporting of this book. And more than anything, this man wants to be on a river, day in, day out, quiet. He goes hours a day without saying a word because he's out there looking for his next rainbow trout. And the people that are closest to him in his life are those old fishing buddies. These are people who he's been on the rivers with for decades at this point. And does he have interest in Allen and Company or TED or Davos? Hell no. He's never set foot in those places. In fact, in the book, I recount the one time he was sort of summoned to Washington to sit on a panel with President Clinton during the late 90s. And he's never been more uncomfortable in his life. He's tried to get out of there as fast as he could. He went straight to Hawaii from that event and immediately broke his arm on a crazy kayaking accident.
You were talking, David, about business leaders in the first Trump administration that care deeply about the environment, and many of those corporations have abandoned those efforts. But I'm just curious, are there still purpose-driven brands? We started this company based on the idea that brands had values aligned with ours and wanted to tell stories, and that they cared about more than simply the bottom line. Do those kinds of companies still exist in your view?
I think they do, but I think the last couple of years has made it harder to take a lot of these statements seriously.
Or to care about social issues when the pendulum has swung in the opposite direction, right?
That's right. And I think this gets right at the truth that if you're always trying to play catch up with the latest news cycle, you're often going to be off balance. And when you see CEOs or companies trying to shift with the wind, whether it's what this administration is prioritizing or what social activists were so vocal about 4 and 5 years ago, you're never going to have a real sense of grounding and identity. And that's, again, where I'm not holding Patagonia up as a perfect example here, but I think the lesson is instructive. The same issues that Chouinard cared about, conservation, environmental activism, as an individual, are the same ones that the company ultimately came to embody. And they have been consistent for decades in saying these are the things we care about. We're going to be judicious in what else we address, but we are unwavering in our understanding of why these matter and the approach we feel like is the right one to take in addressing them, and how we're going to spend our money to support it. I think that discrete portfolio of a few core issues is a model that could serve a lot of other brands very well.
Is Yvon Chouinard still involved in the day-to-day operation of the company?
Not the day-to-day operation, but I'll share one extraordinary example that shows just how much he still cares about the product, the quality. We had been on the river all day. We were in Argentina. And he was.
It sounds like a fun book to write, by the way.
It wasn't the worst reporting experience. I got to go surfing in Chile with some big wave surfers.
Oh
I
my
went
God.
ski touring in Montana in Highlight Canyon. I went to the regenerative agriculture farms, and
Poor
I
thing.
know it was tough. It was tough. Um, he's not involved in the day-to-day operations, but he still really cares about the product. And there was this one day we had been fishing all day in Argentina. We come out of the water. He's the last one out. The sun is setting. And the first thing he does is walk over to a Patagonia product designer who's accompanied him on this trip. And he was wearing that day a prototype jacket. And he goes over to the designer and he starts showing him at a microscopic level the little changes he wants. The Velcro was a little too close to his skin on the cuff, and it itched his skin at one point during the day. The rain gutter on the hood was pretty good, but it could be a little better right here. And that attention to detail at 85 years old on the day of that trip, I think just spoke back to his enduring commitment to the quality of the product. It was there when he was a young man, and it was still there today.
He sounds like such a cool person. And I know that the company is interested in regenerative farming and food. So is that going to be the next chapter for Patagonia? And how did that transition happen?
Chouinard's been interested in food for decades now. In the book, I chronicle his early attempts and failures to sort of start a regenerative food business back, I think in the 80s was the first time. But more recently, the company called Patagonia Provisions has started to find some modest success with a few key businesses. They're really big making tinned fish. It's expensive, like their clothes, but they're making it, and they have a good environmental story to tell. They're making some crackers with regenerative wheat, and they're making beer with a grain called kernza. Now, each of these are small potatoes compared to the big clothing business. But Chouinard told me if he had his way, 50 years from now, Patagonia would be better known as a food company rather than an apparel company. And that's because, unlike the apparel business, he feels like food, if done right, can actually really help the planet rather than just take a toll on it. He sees a path forward for a regenerative business model rather than an extractive one. And so that's his aspiration. I think it's going to be hard.
But interesting. And do you think that there are leaders waiting in the wings that have sort of his single minded focus who can bring the company into the future effectively? As you said, it's been a revolving door, right? And he hasn't been a great manager. Has he kind of helped groom various heirs apparent, I
Yeah.
guess, who could take his place?
Yeah, this has been one of the challenges for this company the entire duration, is finding leaders who have not only the same vision and same priorities as Chouinard and his family, but who can exert their own authority and gravitational pull on the company and be entrusted with taking it to that next right place. I think if you asked Chouinard and the management team right now, they would say they feel like they're in a pretty good place. Ryan Gellert is the current CEO.
He's great. I interviewed him at South by Southwest. I thought he was so nice, but of course I don't work with the guy, so I have no idea.
Yeah, listen, I've interviewed a lot of people who have worked with him, and he gets pretty good marks across the board. I think it's important to note he has the same combination of passions and skills that Chouinard did. He is good with the apparel business. He's got sort of good instincts for it. He has a real commitment to environmentalism. That was something he brought to the table on his own. And he's a real athlete. He's a big-time snowboarder. So he understands that sort of real need for these products to work in the elements.
Right.
And so he's there. There are other executives behind him who I think if you want to get into the gossip, people would identify as potential CEO candidates when Ryan is done. But that's the immediate. You know, look 10 and 15 and 20 years out. Chouinard and his wife Melinda are almost certainly going to be gone from this planet at that point. And who is leading the company then, I think is the big question. And what does Patagonia stand for? Can it maintain its values? This idealism that has sustained it for 50 years in this new ownership structure? We'll see.
Well, the book is called Dirtbag Billionaire, How Yvon Chouinard Built Patagonia, Made a Fortune, and Gave It All Away. David Gallis, who are you going to set your sights on next? Do you know who you're going to write about?
I don't have a new book deal in hand just yet, but I've got some ideas. I think it's important to note, though, whatever I do next, it's got to be a project that brings the same sort of excitement, right? And
Well, good luck with
yeah,
that.
thank you. Yeah, exactly. I got a little self-conscious there. It was like, what am I going to say? But the answer is like, I don't have my next book, but whatever it is, I hope it's a story that is as rich and frankly inspiring, not perfect, but inspiring as this one.
Well, thanks so much for coming. It's great to see you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a treat.